All right, everyone, hello. Thank you so much for coming out this fine Monday morning. My name is Shady Rose. I'm the events manager here at Lost City Books. For those of you who are brand new, who've never been here before, Lost City Books is a new, used, and rare bookstore run by some of DC's coolest kids, such as myself. Oh, gosh. You might know a little bit of the history of this neighborhood. We took over for Idle Time Books, which was here exclusively. So we're happy to fight new awesome things. Before we get started, the first and probably most important is please silence your cell phones. And I need to turn off your vibrator as well, because that can get pretty loud in a quiet room while people are reading. So as you're taking a moment to do that, also a reminder that we will have time for questions at the end of this discussion. So if you have comments and questions that you'd like to share about what you've heard today, please hold those until the end of the presentation, because we'd like to create a very respectful and warm, welcoming environment for our speakers tonight. Lastly, this event is being live streamed simultaneously. None of you are visible, but if you do choose to speak during the question and answer portion, your voice will be audible on our live stream and will be on our YouTube page, just so you know that. So, you know, keep it nice.
Please do.
A few more housekeeping things. There is a nice selection of wine and cookies back there towards the back available for you. Please feel free to drink it if you're over 21 on our system. And the bathroom downstairs is not available right now, but there is a bathroom right towards the back there. It's unlocked. All of that said, thank you for bearing with me through the rigmarole at the beginning there. I would like to welcome you and express my great gratitude to have you all here as we're discussing Reproduction Reconceived with Sara Matthiesen and Melinda Chateauvert. I'm going to introduce these two wonderful people, and thank you so much for joining us. Just so you all know, they are able to take their masks off while they're speaking. Please keep yours on. Sara Matthiesen is an assistant professor of history and women's, gender, and sexuality studies at George Washington University. Professor Mathiesen's new book, Reproduction Reconceived, Family Making and the Limits of Choice After Roe v. Wade, traces how incarceration, disease, poverty, for-profit medical care, and state neglect forced those living in the United States to work much harder to have and maintain family in the decades following the decriminalization of abortion in the US. She is currently at work on a second project that traces the persistence of self-managed and home abortions practices after Roe. Her academic work has been published in Signs, Journal of Women in Culture and Society, Feminist Review, and Women's Review of Books. And she has written for popular audiences in The Nation, the Chronicle of Higher Ed, and Jacobin. Melinda Chateauvert, PhD, is a writer, historian, and activist with 3 decades of experience in movements for gender equality, sexual freedom, and civil rights advocacy. She is the author of Sex Workers Unite, which is also available here today, by the way, A History of the Movement from Stonewall to Slutwalk, and associate director at the Front Porch Research Strategy in New Orleans, LA. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome the both of you, and please take it away.
Thank you so much, Shady, for making this happen and setting up such a lovely event. I can't remove my mask from my earring. Got it. That's funny. Sorry, that made me remember a story of someone who was also in that situation recently. Okay, so thank you so much, Shady. Thank you, Mindy, for joining me tonight. Thanks to all of you for coming. It's really lovely to see so many friendly faces in the audience, and especially thank you to Flavia for making this event happen so we could all be here together in person. I was thinking about the book last year as I was finishing it and wondering if this would even be possible. So the fact that we're all here is very, very special to me. So, and thank you to those of you zooming in despite Zoom fatigue, I'm sure. It's good to have you with us. So I'm gonna start just by saying about three major things that I see the book hoping to intervene in conversations about mainstream reproductive rights issues in the US. I know that many of you just got the book as you entered this lovely bookstore. So hopefully this will get us all on the same page for the conversation that will ensue. So the first thing that the book hopes to shift our thinking about are a couple of major associations that we bring to Roe v. Wade, the Supreme Court case that decriminalized abortion in the US in 1973. Because choice has for so long served as a euphemism for abortion, I think we tend to treat Roe as representing the decision or choice not to have children. And we kind of treat it as the end all be all of reproductive choice. But as we all know from our own, everyday decision making, choice usually entails at least two directions, right? A choice can go one direction or the other. And so when it comes to abortion, yes, we can think about choice as equaling abortion, but we can also think about choice as equaling parenthood or motherhood. And I think it's this second choice that we have focused on less in conversations about Roe. But Roe absolutely also encouraged Americans to think about having children as a choice, and that had some specific consequences. So we also know from recent attacks on access to abortion that have particularly ramped up in the last decade, that choice is a pretty misleading way to characterize your ability to end a pregnancy. If there are so many barriers that stand between you and an abortion, your choice mostly exists in theory. Reproduction Reconceived is really trying to help us make a similar shift in our thinking when we understand family making as a choice. So how much choice did families really have in the decades following Roe v. Wade? What does the landscape look like immediately post-Roe? We can talk about that in a couple of ways. One is we can look at the year before Roe was decided. Thank you. We can look at the year before Roe was decided when in 1972, President Nixon vetoed a bill that had bipartisan support that would have helped to fund a federally funded program of childcare. So that's one kind of blow to choice that we can contemplate. That same year Roe was decided also marks the start of what one historian has dubbed the Age of Inequality. Some key fiscal policy decisions resulted in the majority of Americans ending up poorer at the end of the 1970s than when they started in that decade for the first time since the Great Depression. So these are just a couple of signposts that can help us think about the jumpstart in a conservative shift in politics that really defines the final decades of the 20th century. This is a brand of politics that I think most of us maybe are quite familiar with by now, where fiscal austerity for government spending on social programs is combined with a mantra of personal responsibility. And we tend to cover this under the banner of neoliberalism. But what that means for families is that this brand of politics has the effect of turning those who are unable to support the labors and costs of family making on their own into families that made a bad choice and need to sort of deal with the consequences on their own. So the first thing the book is asking us to sort of change our thinking about is Roe transforms having children into a choice at the exact same time that the state starts to retreat from family making, and at the exact same time that people living in the US are increasingly encouraged to overcome whatever structural barriers they are facing on their own. So that's one thing. Just how widespread was this retreat? In the book, I describe this retreat with the term state neglect. So we can ask, how much did state neglect actually curtail families' choices in the decades following Roe? The answer to this is the second shift that I hope can encourage. So we tend to think about the constraints on family as a conflict between work and home, I think most immediately. The pandemic has encouraged more Americans than ever before to realize that it's actually kind of impossible to both work and take care of a child simultaneously, that actually these are two distinct jobs that require labor and resources. So debates and conversation about universal pre-K that might be hopefully a part of the social spending bill, for example. We could think about that as a majority of people being really amped about the fact that the government might reverse its practice of retreating from family making, of participating in state neglect, and instead invest in the labor of family making. But the book is trying to get us to realize that if we stop at a conflict that only exists between work and home and only looks in those two places, then we're going to greatly underestimate just how pervasive state neglect has been in the past 4 decades or so. So one of the places that the book encourages us to look to help broaden this debate, just to give an example, is the issue of mass incarceration. So incarceration absolutely devastates family making by removing people from their communities, locking them up in places usually quite far distances from their loved ones. And it further constrains family making through neglect that is rampant inside of prisons. So we can just take one example here of a refusal to facilitate incarcerated people's participation in custody hearings, for example, can result in the permanent loss of parental rights. The debate that we euphemistically call work-life balance and how people are supposed to manage these things really misses so many of the places that families are being pressed by neglect. So even if we passed said social spending bill tomorrow, there would still be a ton of work we would have to do to address those various places that neglect stresses family making. And the book is really divided into 5 chapters that consider families who did attempt to make and maintain familial ties in the face of different constraints like the HIV/AIDS epidemic, incarceration, laws that regulated queer family making, a for-profit racist system of healthcare, and an increasing reliance on faith-based charities to provide people with aid. All of that is meant to show that a thorough accounting of state neglect reveals that it does not produce an abundance of choice, but instead produces a contraction of it. Okay, so that's number 2. Only one more. So if state neglect does not produce an abundance of choice, but instead a contraction of it, what does state neglect produce? That answer is the third thing that I hope Reproduction Reconceived can help us to think about. Neglect is a term that I chose because I feel like it implies or makes visible work that remains undone. And that means that someone has to pick up the slack. And if they fail to do so, there are going to be costs. We all have limits to our labor and resources. And when stuff falls through the cracks, there are consequences. So for me and the book, what I try to show is that state neglect has really produced a proliferation of the types of labors required to maintain family and a ledger of costs that accumulated when that work went undone. These costs have been borne most heavily by families themselves. We can look at another organization that I examined in the book, a project called Prison Mothers and Their Children Together that was started at a federal prison in California in the late 1970s. This volunteer organization, comprised of members on both sides of the prison wall, attempted to maintain incarcerated women's familial ties by creating a children's center that was open for children to come visit every weekend. It entailed, coordinating rides from foster parents to get the children to the prison, making sure that women's parental rights were respected and maintained to the best of members' abilities, and negotiating with social welfare agencies and judges to make sure that those rights weren't permanently extinguished. And I talk at length in the book about the various programming the organization undertook on really quite a shoestring budget and limited people power. So Reproduction Reconceived asks us to see something like prison mothers and their children together, or prison match, as evidence of how mass incarceration, and especially carceral neglect on the inside of prisons, produces a new form of reproductive labor. In order for women to be able to mother from behind bars, as the program's sort of campaign described it, there are extensive labors that have to be undertaken and sort of work around and within the confines of the prison itself. That labor disproportionately fell in this case and continues to fall on those most targeted by criminalization. Poor women who are the primary caretakers of small children whose familial ties are disrupted by incarceration, and those who are, and of those, they are more likely to be Black and fail to meet normative expectations of gender and sexuality. So the punishment and neglect sort of compounds to create this condition. I'm also asking people with the book to understand that when projects like Prison Match are defunded and otherwise undermined by correctional officers and prison officials, lack of interest or willful neglect or failure to support, that there are clear costs, and those costs are most heavily borne by families who are most impacted. We tend to think of costs in the economic sense, I think, when we talk about family making, and certainly we've been trading a lot of numbers around with the debate over the social spending bill. But in chapter after chapter, the book tries to show that the costs of losing custody of one's child, of an infant dying before they reach their first birthday, of the stress of simply trying to make ends meet day in and day out to make sure that families survive, that those costs are incalculable, but they also demand our accounting. Ultimately, the book hopes to bring this account and to ask us to bring a sense of urgency to what the state has not done when it comes to supporting families, and assess the costs of treating family making as a privilege rather than a right or a public good, that there are inherent costs to that decision in how we regard family. And ultimately, it asks us, or it makes the case to all of you, that this is necessary if we want to understand what remains between us and true reproductive freedom for all. So I hope that that can give us kind of a jumping off point and talk about the book a little more. Oh yeah, I'm going to read some of the book. Now I'm going to read some of the book. Okay, so this is from chapter titled "The Labor of Captivity, Incarcerated Mothers and Their Children." In the early evening of December 16th, 1975, during dinner hour at the California Institution for Women, abbreviated as CIW for our listeners, incarcerated women used rags to ignite a fire in Wilson A Cottage, then gathered the decorations meant to bring Christmas cheer to the otherwise sterile TV room and headed to the administration building. There, they lit the decorations on fire inside of a trash can and hurled the flaming can through Superintendent Brooke Carey's office window, scattering broken glass, 2 Christmas trees, and charred decorations as they moved, according to Carey, quote, en masse screaming and yelling from one building to another. While CIW firefighters attempted to keep Wilson A Cottage from burning, dousing women in fire extinguisher fluid in the process, Lieutenant Walters sent Sergeant Martina to guard the armory and issued chemical agents to the other correctional officers intent on defending the rest of the administration building. The officers exhausted their tear gas supply in less than 10 minutes, but were quickly supplied with aid from a neighboring men's prison, whose superintendent sent staff, guns, and gas to CIW. Officers of the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department dispatched units to the perimeter of CIW and lent their helicopters so that the entire grounds were illuminated by a circling searchlight. With the prison secured, the mix of state and county officials turned to, quote, the apprehension of the roaming and marauding inmates, unquote. The nearly 500 women who participated in the riot did not heed repeated orders that they lock up, instead brandishing glass and bricks against prison staff. It was not until officers raised their 12-gauge shotguns to fire warning shots into the air, sending women to their units, that staff declared the situation clear. By then, it was nearly 3 o'clock in the morning. In her report to Director of the California Department of Corrections, J.J. Enomoto, Superintendent Carey seemed to take comfort that the protest was not, quote, a pre-planned course of action on the part of the inmates, but rather a spontaneous release of hostility resulting from the administration's decision to rescind the privilege of allowing any more outside visitors to come in and bring food for Christmas parties, unquote. On the night of the riot, officers had informed the Women's Advisory Council that remaining holiday parties would be closed to visitors due to concerns about security and the possibility of escape risks. The riot, even when filtered through numerous correctional officers' reports, makes clear that while the, quote, release of hostility may have been spontaneous, it stemmed from an accumulation of insults. In addition to keeping women's loved ones away during the holidays, one woman mentioned that they had also been barred from using the telephone, a so-called privilege, prompting her to threaten, quote, we'll show you what we can do. The women's rage was driven as much by the punitive removal of these so-called privileges as by the neglectful response to their concerns. When Sergeant Searcy tried to quell the protest by telling the women that they had made their point and so should return to their cottages, they reportedly responded, quote, why should we? You motherfuckers always say, yeah, we'll take care of it, but you fuckers never do anything, so we are not locking up, unquote. Another woman echoed her peers' sense of desperation and determination, quote, kill me, but I won't stop or go to my cottage. In response to the riot, CIW officials made good on a plan to turn Harrison Cottage into an alternative program unit. Staff felt that they needed to be able to separate from the general prison population certain women who caused, quote, serious problems within the institution, a need made clearer by the riot. First-hand accounts from women who had been sent to the APU prompted community concern from outside groups like the State Bar Committee on Corrections and the San Francisco Bay Area-based Women's Prison Coalition, which charged that the incarcerated women assigned to the APU would undergo inhumane behavior modification treatment. CDC Director Enomoto deflected these accusations by stating that the APU was still in its proposal phase. Representatives for the prison assured inquiring state officials that the APU would include, quote, recreation, entertainment, schooling, and other activities, while conceding that there would be, quote, limitation on movement. Enomoto assured advocates that CIW staff would, quote, achieve a correctional system that is increasingly humane, fair, and safe. The Christmas riot at CIW and the subsequent APU debate provide a window into anti-prison organizing on the threshold of mass incarceration. Incarcerated people, supported by progressive social movements, were rebelling against the punishment, neglect, and legacy of rehabilitation that defined captivity in the United States. For incarcerated people everywhere, conditions of confinement entailed a variety of inhumane horrors, sometimes carried out under the cover of quote unquote treatment, like the alternative programming promised by CIW staff. Such initiatives laid bare critiques of rehabilitation that remain relevant today. Treatment regimens administered by the same institution that imprisoned human beings as its primary objective could only ever offer truly grotesque contradiction in terms, such as placing, for example, trans, queer, and gender nonconforming incarcerated people in solitary confinement, ostensibly for their own protection. Furthermore, invocations of treatment presume that incarcerated people themselves, rather than the traumatic and inhumane conditions that characterize incarceration, represented some kind of deviation in need of fixing. By the time the APU was pursued at CIW, an institution that disguised cages as cottages in a campus-like environment, prison uprisings had convinced a large swath of the public that the so-called treatment principle was bankrupt. The idea that criminality could be cured through rehabilitation was repeatedly rejected by liberals and progressives alike. In a landmark 1971 report, the American Friends Service Committee charged that, quote, the punitive spirit of incarceration survives unscathed behind the mask of treatment. This critical shift in the perception of prisons forced open the question of what incarceration would become. When Enomoto wrote of a, quote, increasingly humane, fair, and safe system, then he was describing one possible future rather than the continuation of a successful legacy. By now, most of the world knows what direction incarceration in the United States took instead, at least in broad strokes. The 1970s Law and Order campaign struck a death knell to even the mask of rehabilitation, and in its place, a new model took hold: incapacitation on a massive scale. This development produced a situation in which the United States imprisons more people per capita than any other nation, housing nearly a quarter of the entire world's prison population. Often described as a punitive turn in the administration of prisons, tougher sentencing laws, expanded prosecutorial powers, massive investment in prison construction, and an unprecedented use of solitary confinement characterized mass incarceration in the United States. Growing awareness of mass incarceration in recent years has ensured many Americans are familiar with this narrative. But additional work on incarceration illustrates how, quote, one of the most volatile points of contact between state violence and one's body is the domain of gender. And I think this insight has yet to achieve the same level of public recognition. Nonetheless, scholars and activists helping to advance this urgent argument have shown how such a statement holds true both before and after the so-called punitive turn. Sexual violence, sometimes lethal conditions of labor exploitation, psychological torture through forced drugging, discrimination in sentencing and parole, reproductive violence in the form of shackling during childbirth and forced sterilization, as well as abysmal and near non-existent healthcare. It comprised just some of the punishments carried out in the domain of gender as it intersects with white supremacy and capitalism. Scholars have also refuted claims that the criminal justice system is meant to protect from harm the women it so frequently punishes, those who are Black, Latina, Indigenous, poor, immigrant, and or do not meet normative expectations of gender and sexuality. But on the eve of December 16, 1975, the punitive turn towards warehousing was not yet a foregone conclusion, and women incarcerated at CIW were protesting not just explicit punishment, the revoking of privileges, the use of tear gas and shotguns, or the inherent contradictions of treatment, Christmas parties in cage cottages, alternative programming, but also a third fundamental feature of incarceration, carceral neglect. You fuckers never do anything. For incarcerated women, neglect, whether through willful failure, indifference, or policy gaps, especially imperiled their caretaking responsibilities and desires. The barring of visitors at Christmas represents how familial ties were necessarily severed by the fact of incarceration, but this punishment went hand in hand with neglect that meant such ties were often permanently extinguished. A social worker might use the canceled visit as proof of a woman's lack of investment in her child's welfare, for example. The utter failure or refusal to acknowledge the legal significance of such a visit was only the tip of the iceberg. For women taking care of children prior to incarceration, the inability to regularly communicate and visit with their children, much less ensure the legal status of their custody, was due to total neglect of their familial desires and obligations. Such neglect extended beyond familial ties that had existed before a woman's sentence. When Barbara Cardell gave birth to a baby boy 8 days after the CIW uprising, the infant was promptly placed in foster care despite Cardell's objections. Superintendent Carey used the neglectful conditions at CIW to justify the punishment of taking away Cardell's child, explaining that, quote, CIW does not have the necessary facilities to provide a proper home. Neglect also brought other forms of devastation to women's lives while confined to prison. When Annette Harris began experiencing vaginal bleeding in the 4th month of her pregnancy, CIW staff ignored her condition for 3 months until she was rushed to the hospital because her severe abdominal pain had induced vomiting. She gave birth to her son in the ambulance on the way to the hospital, and he died 2 hours later. When women's reproductive labors challenged Superintendent Carey's claim that a prison could not be, quote, a proper home. And together with advocates on the outside, incarcerated women attempted to force corrections to account for the family making that was a fundamental aspect of their lives. The majority of incarcerated women were primary caretakers of small children prior to their criminalization, and this reality did not vanish just because families were separated by prison walls. Similarly, women who entered prisons pregnant had distinct medical and legal needs. Women asserted that the loss of their children, whether to the foster care system, to death as a result of medical neglect, or to the distance imposed by the loss of liberty, were egregious violations of their rights and humanity. They argued that their status as prisoners did not preclude the prison from making it possible to continue their role as mothers. Incarcerated women fought to keep their families together in the face of carceral neglect. As women and their children were separated by incarceration in the final decades of the 20th century, the attempts by families and their advocates to restore familial ties forced prison authorities to confront incarcerated women's family making. The ensuing battles and their outcomes evidence how mass incarceration produced new forms of reproductive labor as families fought to remain intact in the face of state punishment and neglect.
Well, I think this is when I get to start asking questions. And Sarah, oh, I get to take my mask off too. Yay! So thank you, Sarah. I think that really helped us to think about some of these issues and think a little bit more explicitly about what you meant by neglect. And I think the example of what happened with the prison, the conditions under which prison was created was really important. But I want to actually kind of steer our conversation perhaps a little bit more broadly to think about this book as I was reading and some of the larger questions that I think we can also draw from it. But I think you can supply the specifics from the book and we can talk about it. One of the questions that you say right in the early part, you posit or you claim that this book is a labor history. And I'm a labor historian, and this doesn't look like labor history to what the tradition, Nelson Leckenberg and all the rest of them might have called it. Okay. So I'm wondering, what did you mean by making it a labor history? What does it mean in terms of challenging the way historians and other labor activists, I'll make it broader than that, have written, how they've written about or how they've approached what we call women's labor or women's work in the past and in the future. I noticed at one point you in fact talked about a program that women might be released as mother release and compare it to work release. So do you want to explain that a little bit?
Sure, thank you. That's such a great question. Even as I wrote that sentence, I thought that it was maybe a bit provocative. So I'm glad that you pulled it out. Because, I am, as I said in my opening remarks, the book is really trying. I had a methodological issue with the book, which is or a question, which is, how do you make visible what the state isn't doing to support families? And the way that I answered that was by trying to sort of beat the reader over the head with the immense amounts of labor that families had to take on themselves simply to survive these varied conditions that I chart in the book. And I'm obviously indebted to prior movements that have asserted that the labor of caretaking, of mothering one's own children, so the National Welfare Rights Organization comes to mind, that is legitimate labor for which women should be compensated so that they can stay home and do the job of raising their children. And I'm also obviously indebted to Marxist feminists who talk about how reproductive labor is invisible labor that is deeply profitable for capitalism because it is reproducing a workforce for free. And so I think I wanted to contribute to those conversations a labor history that really charted in specific terms, okay, So we have this term reproductive labor. It's pretty broad. It gets invoked in different ways. But I think usually it is assuming that the labor of family making happens in the home. Maybe sometimes the labor of family making is a battle over welfare aid and welfare rights. But actually the labor required to maintain family in the face of many developments that defined the last 50 years or so happened far beyond those places. And so I tried to follow the labor, so to speak, that was required to have family be accessible despite the constraints of poverty, of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, of incarceration, of state retrenchment that then is replaced with a reliance on faith-based charities, particularly pro-life faith-based charities that I talk about in the last chapter. I really wanted, and even every chapter is organized the labor of. I wanted people to no longer, I guess, be able to deny that family making is a labor and resource intensive endeavor, and that it happens in places that we don't expect or often look, and that those places really deserve our attention.
And I think by bringing out that labor, and in fact showing what's happened since the Roe decision, one of the other things that's simultaneously happening since my formal labor history period was more about thinking about it in the 1920s and 30s when we talked about a family wage, which then privatized women's work because the husband was bringing in enough wages that the wages for housework were actually enwrapped in that family wage. And we've now substituted that for some sort of idea about a living wage, which is still, even a living wage would require at least 2 living wages to have children. So there is a kind of shift that's happened within that. And I think that's what you're capturing in terms of being a labor history. And I find it really provocative. So one of the things, and I think I was just going to also follow up, and you do mention the Domestic Workers Project and their organizing through Age and her work, which has so much tried to not only get the wages for the workers who are in the home formally doing the work with privileged people, which we know that's what that is, but even some of this new labor organizing, which has tried to address people in a more privatized, women working in more privatized or gig economies, has addressed specifically the needs for childcare, the needs for larger kinds of support activities, not just focusing on wages and conditions per se, and it's a larger program. So that brings me to also think then, because Agent's work in terms of organizing is always something that I used when I was teaching courses on community organizing. And one of the things that I also see in this book is that it is a book about community activism. It's about organizing. And so I guess what I would like to ask you too, if you were thinking about this as you're thinking through this whole book, and maybe the audience here would be interested as well, is what campaign tactics or strategies did people engage in that you think were particularly effective for creating policy change? Were there things that that you think were particularly, they may have been time historically perfect at that time, but what in hindsight would you advise in terms of that, or what counter moves that officials did that you might want to watch out for? The commission is always, I think, one of the big, when they say they're going to appoint a commission, you haven't done enough because you haven't, right? Any commission studying something is a problem. And we see that happening a lot of times, right? So let them appoint a commission. It won't work. But what are some of the other things that you see happening?
Yeah, I love that question. Thank you so much. Couldn't agree more about the commission. Be wary of that. So, I mean, one thing that comes to mind is the chapter that looks at campaigns against Black infant mortality that emerged at the local level in the late 1970s. By the mid 1980s, Congress is in sort of a full-fledged debate about the crisis of infant mortality. But before it gets to Congress, in places like Oakland, California, and Philadelphia, in Pennsylvania. Grassroots organizations are drawing attention to the fact that in Oakland and in Philly, also Harlem, that there is, a rate that Black infants die at a rate twice as high as white infants. And the Third World Women's Alliance is one group I look at that's operating in Oakland, and the Maternity Care Coalition forms in Philly to do similar work. And I think that a couple of things that the TWWA does, they create a coalition to fight infant mortality, one. So it's not just the TWWA, there's a bunch of community organizations that are operating in Oakland to kind of bring this to the attention of the city council for Alameda County, which is where Oakland resides. And they have a very effective campaign in which they accuse the city council members of genocide by neglect. And one thing that I think is so important about that campaign is that by the time the issue of infant mortality gets to kind of the congressional level, there's a lot of debating back and forth about the nitty gritty of statistical analysis of, okay, well, how do we know what is causing the rates of infant mortality? Because it's always a battle of, the activists say it's systemic, right? It's lack of accessible healthcare and affordable healthcare. It's racism and misogyny within the healthcare itself. It's poverty, it's unstable housing. And politicians say, no, it's individual behaviors that women are engaging in. They don't know what to do when they're pregnant. They don't eat right, et cetera, et cetera. All of these really,
and even a racial sides too.
Yes, very shaming and blaming campaigns that veer towards the implication that Black women in particular are already unfit to mother, or don't care about their infant before it has even arrived. And so the campaign, I think, does a good job of resisting the fetishization of quantifying these causes by always asserting that these forces are operating simultaneously, and always holding the city council members' decision, particularly their budgetary decision making, accountable for the conditions that that women are facing. And one thing that they do, to Mindy's point, your point about the commission, is they actually ask the city council, we want to conduct a study, a community study that we have control over, that investigates conditions at the only publicly funded hospital in Alameda County, Highland Hospital. The council says, well, we'll do a study, but we're going to contract this healthcare group organization to conduct it. So rather than say, okay, we'll take that study, the TWWA and the coalition go on to conduct their own community study alongside the official study. And so at the city council hearings where the study results are being revealed, there's actually this dueling of results. And that allows the Coalition to Fight Infant Mortality control over the narrative, so that they don't have to acquiesce to the numbers game that the official study has commissioned, or is allowing city council members to use to say, no, look, we really can show that the responsibility lies with women themselves, as opposed to the narrative that the coalition wants to put forward, which is that, no, the responsibility lies with the people who are in charge of maintaining the conditions at Highland and making sure that it has the resources it needs. So that was one thing that I thought was very savvy about that campaign, that they basically didn't trust the city council commission study to do due diligence, and were able to draw on this other resource. It is the case that the book, maybe has lessons learned more than like this really works. So I wanted to lead with the tactic that I thought was very savvy before like getting into the lessons learned part, because the other thing that happens in this, or that I chart in this chapter, is by the time the debate over what to do about Black infant mortality reaches Congress, this diagnosis that local grassroots groups have offered, that you can't really choose, you can't highlight one thing that is one deficit in women's lives that is causing this. You have to like think about it holistically, what we would now call intersectionally. By the time it gets to Congress, there's big debate happening over expanding Medicaid so that women have access to Medicaid starting with their pregnancy, as opposed to right at the point of delivery. And it becomes a debate over what I describe in the book as a piecemeal reform, that also has consequences for other types of aid that often accompany access to Medicaid, in this case, welfare. And I guess that's getting too nitty-gritty into the policy details of what happens. But the point that I'm trying to make is that the grassroots campaigns, I think, have a way of offering a very compelling, holistic diagnosis. And by the time it gets to the level of policy, there's debates over, okay, well, will we just like extend this much healthcare in this direction to do as little as possible to make it seem like we're addressing the problem? And the lesson learned, I guess, that I'm offering from that kind of unfortunate outcome is that, campaigns should really resist, I think, piecemeal reforms, like things that expand access to aid one little thing at a time. So I guess we can think about like Medicare for all versus debates that are happening around further expansion of Medicaid, that are transpiring in our current moment as one place we might apply that lessons learned. But those are a couple of things I would say.
And require a lot more work.
Yes.
And political work. And
yes, a lot more political work. Yes.
Well, that actually leads to the kind of last question I have, and then we'll turn it over for everybody else to grill you on other issues.
Oh, great.
Okay. All right. Because I think that one of the things that raises is this, what nonprofits often deal with is the tension between providing services and policy advocacy. And I think your chapter on the pregnancy centers is one very brave, because they're not something that's ever really put into a discussion about, quote, choice, right? I mean, it's interesting in terms of the way the literature reads. And that's why I say it's brave to bring those in, because it does highlight the way that so many of the reproductive rights, narrow slight type organizations kept focusing on court cases, right? And keeping clinics open, while at the same time not meeting women's needs, which really opens up that void for reproductive justice framework that Dazon and all these other people began to start really trying to provide. So I guess my question, if there is one in that, is then that larger thing, do you see the movement or work moving more towards doing that service provision? I mean, how can we really think about it? Because in some ways, that service provision that organizations, HIPS, for example, in which I've been involved in for a long time, we spend a lot more time doing services than we can do advocacy. And our funding gets caught so that it's only people will fund services. They will not fund doing political work. The C3 gets funded and taxed, and the C4 does not. So we actually have this very interesting kind of tension where local organizations, community organizations seem to be doing something, but I don't know if I would speak to that. There's even a question in that, but I don't know, comment.
I mean, yeah, that is another important, I mean, you're absolutely right that's another important tension, for lack of a better word, that the book repeatedly unearthed or illustrates for the reader, that I'm hesitating because I'm like, Sarah, you don't have like a good answer to what to do about this problem that Mindy has diagnosed, and that the book diagnoses over and over again. But you know, it is a bit related to your second question about like tactics for organizing, because on the one hand, I am deeply admiring of and inspired by the immense service provision / mutual aid efforts that many of the organizations in the book are able to carry out. And on the other hand, it is the case that those efforts absolutely detract from advocacy, broader advocacy plans that organizations initially formed to carry out.
Right.
And that they often or always, most of the time, cannot meet the immense need
And the
that
yeah.
within the community that they're trying to serve. And so that does become an issue. And I think that I'm like sympathetic to this problem, and I feel conflicted about it myself, even when thinking about engaging in, you know, mutual aid efforts that are ongoing in DC and elsewhere, and kind of the arrival of mutual aid as a strategy in mainstream consciousness post the pandemic, I think has been amazing to get for people to understand that, you know, mutual aid teaches us that charity and philanthropy are not the models that we want, because they do means testing and they need you to prove that you're deserving to get basic necessities. And mutual aid is like so liberating because it says you don't need to do any of that. Everyone deserves to have their basic needs met. And at the same time, the scale of those projects needs to be so large to meet the need that you can, you know, sort of feel like it's a never ending
struggle.
Yeah.
So moving to I agree.
Thank you for that question.
It is. Really
I welcome also thoughts from the audience on this question, because I know there's many brilliant activists in the room. But that's just my 2 cents on it.
And we can take questions from the audience now. We're burning with desire. Whatever.
We'll take questions, and also for those of you watching at home, can you turn that mic that way? Yeah. For those of you watching at home, you can leave a comment on the video that you're watching now, and we'll get to that question as well.
I can start.
Please do.
Thank you so much for that. I won't say my name for privacy purposes. So I wanted to add on to what you've said in terms of mutual aid being the desired result, because people have more equal chances of getting access to that, and you don't have to like roll in the ground and beg for that.
Right.
So for me, it would be, how do we then turn the people with the money into this side, essentially? I don't know if it would be a good example to use the Kaepernick when he, bent the knee. So it would almost be an equivalent of that, but for these big people with the money.
Mm-hmm.
That would be my 2 cents on that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how to phrase that too, but that would be, since we're just throwing things and making something stick on the wall.
Yeah.
The other thing that I wanted to ask about or, consider is, do you think that as woke people, activists, whatever you want to call it, do you think that we are held back by the desire to be perfect, in that we try to achieve social impact through the right way, the perfect way, and as a result, we're held back, yet billionaires are literally, undercutting 50 cents per hour, whatever it is, like poor labor conditions and whatnot. So you'll find even the next best thing would be like, let's say, minimum wage. And so maybe we could have like a social enterprise type thing whereby, you're meeting the minimum wage, yes, they're getting just the bare minimum, but you're giving this bigger part of it to, let's say, medical care, to whatever it is. do you think that we are limited so much by our desire to be perfect? Even in the civil, we've seen, I don't really believe in cancel culture, but let's assume cancel culture. So someone will say, okay, this funder, we can't work with them anymore. So our morals really worth people's livelihoods. Yeah, I think that's like the entire question. Like, of course, there's a line you can't cross, but I feel like maybe we focus more about us and appearing pure versus actual lives in the streets. And again, which takes us back to you saying that they shouldn't accept any pennies. Yeah. So let's prove a point, but lives are dying. Yeah. So how do we mentally? I hope the question.
Yeah.
Quite.
No, it's an excellent question, and it definitely I hear you. I mean, I think the part that I always stumble over in this question is one of the things you said toward the end of like, well, of course there's a line we shouldn't draw, and that line is different for everyone. And so that makes it hard to kind of come to an agreement on a program and how we should sort of move forward, because I don't think there's agreement on where that line gets drawn. I think that it is maybe surely it's possible that activists maybe worry too much about, like, I hear you describing sort of like a purity politics, and maybe that is at play. But I also think that people are really trying, as you said, throwing things at the wall and seeing what works, like trying a bunch of different tactics to see what can produce results in the face of immense opposition. And so I guess I feel like it's important to remember kind of, as you pointed out, like what we're up against when we are evaluating successes, that we are operating under really challenging conditions. The thing that, if I'm to draw sort of a lesson from the book in relation to this question, the thing that I think is worth paying attention to, that I hope doesn't slide into purity politics, but maybe gets a little bit at your question, is that it can be helpful to make sure we're paying attention to the internal logics of campaigns. So I've been thinking about this a lot. So that to me is different than, okay, does this demand go far enough? And I guess I'll try to explain what I mean by that. I've been thinking about this in terms of the fight over whether or not paid family and medical leave is going to stay in the social spending bill. And there was this article in the New York Times where the director of the Institute for Women's Policy Research, C. Nicole Mason, said, we've obviously shifted the Overton window. Everyone is clear that we need paid family and medical leave, but also obviously the window is now closing because, right, paid family medical leave keeps falling out of the social spending bill. And if you remember back in spring during pandemic, the way that the Biden administration has talked about paid family and medical leave, the way that many feminist economists advising the Biden administration have talked about paid family and medical leave, is that it's necessary in order for women to get back to work for the health of our economy. And to me, that makes me wonder, well, have we opened the right window with that question or that argument? Because I don't know that paid family and medical leave is that the purpose of that is to ensure the health of our economy. The purpose of that is to ensure the health of the people who have an infant and need to recover it, and also keep that infant alive for the next, however many years it takes for humans to become self-sufficient. And so to me, that is, I hope that's not sliding into purity politics so much as asking us to pay attention to the way we frame our demands and these sort of unspoken arguments that make it into our demands. Because I think that I'm way more compelled by an argument or campaign for paid family medical leave that's like, you deserve to stay at home and recover from birth and be with your newborn because that's what you deserve and because that's what will be healthy for our society, then you should get this so that like you can get back to work. So that's one thing that comes to mind in relation to your very excellent and also vexing question. So thank you for that.
Yes. Perhaps we're getting at the topic of your upcoming project on self-managed abortion. We've been hearing a lot of discourse, possibly tension between larger, more mainstream choice, and I say choice intentionally, as opposed to reproductive justice or abortion access organizations around, does supporting self-managed abortion as a viable option either decrease a sense of urgency, as that really unfortunate article by the Plan C founder purported, or does it just change the conversation in an unhelpful way? How do you feel that the option of self-managed abortion and the spreading of information around it relates to this concept you seem to endorse, that Roe, as some people were saying on Twitter this morning, is the floor and not the ceiling, that it isn't our own responsibility to take care of our reproductive health, of our reproductive freedom, but it is the responsibility of the world to create a place where it is safe and welcoming? Thank you.
Yeah, that's such an excellent question. And again, I think gets us back to the tension between, the tension between mutual aid and like broader supports and kind of infrastructure that would allow for people to realize the demand that feminists and many abortion rights activists, though I suppose not all, pre-Roe had, which was free abortions on demand, which is very different than like abortion negotiated between you and your doctor if you can pay for it. I mean, the Young Lords Party said community free abortion on demand if we can have community control over the procedure to make sure that it doesn't slide into reproductive coercion. So there are all these like visions of what abortion access would look like pre-Roe that we have really been disciplined out of remembering, because Roe has always been under assault and it feels like it needs shoring up because but now Twitter is telling us it's the floor, not the ceiling, which is great. I'm with that. But to get to your question, I think that I invoke the prior campaign of free abortions on demand because there is something very empowering about the information sharing around self-managed abortion that actually, and I guess I'm trying to draw a historical through line to the fact that many abortion rights activists understood and hoped that abortion could be something that women had knowledge of, could administer themselves, or could administer with the help of one another, and information sharing around self-managed abortion that exists today, which has in some ways become so much easier because we have medical abortion, and getting the medical abortions delivered to your home is something many people do in order to end a pregnancy without ever going to a clinic. And so I think that information is deeply empowering and important. I don't know if I agree with that article that it like diminishes urgency, because I think people feel a lot of urgency, and we see that self-managed abortion is kind of going to be the next terrain of criminalization. And so that's another thing to look out for, and also and I think all the more reason to keep sharing and bolstering networks that do allow for people to have access to the practice of self-managed abortion. But it does get you, I feel like your question is highlighting this tension of, does an over-reliance on self-managed abortion without kind of an accompanying legal infrastructure that protects that right devolve too much into, okay, you're on your own, you take responsibility for your situation.
And what happens if it goes wrong?
Yes.
And then what are the implications and the problems that would come from that? Because then there could be legal action. There could be all sorts of things that happen from that too.
Yes.
So it's also kind of that consistent thing that you have also in this book about the tension between having a right and being able to exercise that right. The privilege to be able to exercise that right is what has been the whole system of neglect that you continually highlight. is that when you have neglect, obviously it's not just you don't have the right, but it's also complicating this idea of privilege and who can do what.
Yeah, and the space between the right existing in theory and what is required to exercise it being quite vast.
You've referred, thank you for your talk. You've referred a couple times to for-profit healthcare, and I have a peculiar interest maybe in for-profits versus nonprofits.
Okay.
And my sense is our healthcare system is a good part nonprofit as well as for-profit. And I'm wondering whether you're also indicting the nonprofit part of it, or just if you could talk a little bit about that portion of your book.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, I guess when I am talking about that, I am making a broad statement about the way that we conceptualize healthcare as not something that we do subject to the marketplace, instead of making sure that everyone has access to it. And I mean, in the chapter that most closely looks at healthcare, which is the debate over Medicaid expansion, it is the fact that, I think this is what you're getting at about nonprofit, it is the fact that that is a debate over a federally funded program. But part of the negotiations that go on in that chapter have to do with making sure that have to do with separating out people's access to Medicaid from people's access to welfare. And so there's this exchange of benefits that happens by the outcome of the decision to endorse Medicaid expansion. And so even within parts of our healthcare system that are federally funded, there is this cost analysis and profit considerations are always at the forefront. What the price tag is going to be. I mean, this is all we've been hearing about in terms of the infrastructure bill and the social spending bill is, will we be able to pay for, how will we pay for it? Will we be able to pay for it? And I think that's kind of the logic that I'm trying to capture when I use that phrase and when I trace it out in that chapter. And why in the opening remarks, I tried really to point out that the book, yes, is attentive to economic calculations, but also wanting us to expand the costs that accompany a lack of investment in infrastructure that will actually make family accessible. So,
well, and also that has implications for greater costs down the line. I mean, the point I think that so much of this is about is that neglect is actually very costly, because, if you talk about the children who are taken away at the age of 8 hours old and then become lifelong institutionalized people, right? Then you've also got a cost that is not just a government cost, but a cost of public good, a cost of building citizens, and a cost of, creating a society where people are cared for and care for each other. So I think, that is part of really where a lot of this is about. I mean, it's the neglect that you point out, but it's also, as you said in your remarks, that we also have to think about, well, that neglect is also undermining the public good. And we haven't had those discussions for a very long time, or have that be a central kind of motivation for a lot of the policy work. It's all been green eye shades, as we like to say. Anybody else have any other questions? Yeah. That's you.
Going back to the tension between service and advocacy, I just was thinking about how mass political organizations in societies with great need always use direct service provision as a way of building their base. And from the Black Panthers to the Muslim Brotherhood. And so thinking about it in that way, there's going to be an inherent tension, but it matters what ideological grounding and vision you're bringing to your work as to whether you're going to build a mass organization or whether you're going to remain a nonprofit, you know, or a mass movement. And so my question, Sarah, is what does the stories of organizing in your book tell you about what that mass movement organization should look like to realize its potential?
Wow, great question, Nell. Thank you so much. What does it tell me? I mean, you sort of already described another way that I thought I might answer an earlier one of Mindy's questions, which is that another tactic to learn from, and this isn't like a bad lessons learned, this is like this, you know, this is an admirable, this is something to be replicated, is that all of the organizing efforts, in addition to the service provision or mutual aid, really incorporate, you know, support groups, and I think sharing, however you want to call it, support groups, consciousness raising, sharing sessions that allow for the shame that is sort of brought on to women themselves, who are made to feel responsible for conditions not of their own making, and turn that outward to the systems that are responsible for producing those conditions. And we know, as you have said already, Nell, that one of the reasons that mutual aid has been such an important part of organizing is precisely because it shifts people's thinking into, am I deserving or not, into, yes, I am. And in fact, these are the forces in play that need to be held accountable so that everyone can have their needs met. And that is a really powerful part, I think, of the book, that happens in these small places, and that maybe like, you know, shows up in the archives and is it's like these moments where you see just how intimate the process of politicization on an individual level is, particularly when you're dealing with overcoming the blame and shame and racism and misogyny of a society that tells you that it is literally your fault that your infant does not live to see its first birthday. And so I don't know that I have like a political program to give you from that insight, unfortunately, about like what should these mass organizations look like, but that I want to reassert or kind of affirm what you've already said about the importance of that shift in one's thinking, and that like the book actually concludes with a call for all of us to shift our thinking and understand that when families are struggling in the face of constraints, to realize that those are conditions not of their own making, those are conditions not of our own making. And when people come together in that realization and decide to try and make those conditions better, that is when I think we can truly value family in a new way and create sort of the conditions Mindy was describing as a place where we care for one another and people are cared for. So that's what I would say.
I think we'll wrap there because it sounds like a good place. Thank you very much for coming.
All right, everyone, we have a few minutes where you can choose to mingle and chat with each other and grab your copies of the books. If you bought your book on the Eventbrite page and bought the ticket that is a copy of the book, that's going to be downstairs for you with your name on it. So take those first because they're already sold out of our system. If you didn't do that, we have copies up here.
I have a question.